Heidegger proposes a new term for man, which he calls Dasein. In its essence, Dasein having its being to be, and as its own, takes a further form in Dasein always understanding itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibilities to be itself or not itself, in what it chooses, gets itself into, or grows up in already. It is absurd to even ask the question about the reality of the world. According to him, the question of whether there is a world at all, or whether its being can be proved, makes no sense if it is raised by Dasein as being in the world. And who else would raise it? In the positive mode, solicitude has two extreme possibilities. It can leap in for the other, taking care away from him. And this allows the other to disburden himself, but at the same time becomes someone who is dependent, or in some sense dominated. By contrast, it is possible to have a kind of solicitude that leaps ahead of the other and gives care authentically back to him. This leaping ahead is one that pertains not to a what for the other, but to his potentiality for being. Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. This time it's something for those of you who think that philosophers should concentrate on the meaning of life. It has to do with a classic book, 1927, Being and Time by Martin Heidegger. Now, before we get into arguments in the comments section, I will disclose, yes, I am aware that Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. I do not approve of that, just as I do not approve of him having extramarital affairs. Maybe sometimes a good book is written by a bad man, and this book has nothing to do with those issues. And just as I disapprove of the Nazis, I disapprove of censorship. So, with that out of the way, this is one of the longer ones I probably will ever do, and this presentation does have a bit of an interpretational thesis from myself, but in addition, I think it is also a good introduction to the being part of Being in Time. So, welcome to Heidegger's Being in the World. Martin Heidegger is largely considered to be the greatest of the existentialist philosophers, although he did not accept the term. His monumental work, Sein und Zeit, or Being in Time, published in 1927, is among the more original philosophy books in the modern era. It was intended by its author to be the first part of a project that promised a revolution in ontology, the study of being, in its different analysis of man, an analysis that dispenses with defining him as a rational animal or thinking thing, and having his intellectual capacity constitute his essence. Although admitting that intellectual endeavors are part of our capacities, and that such is what we are at least part of the time, Heidegger instead seeks to probe man and define him in terms of what he calls his everydayness. In doing so, he will also seek to explain how man has a world in a more practical sense than simply having a world of nature to be studied, but also a world of his dealings and his relationship to that world that is, in a sense, his world. In much talk about Heidegger, there is a focus on the existentialist themes in Being in Time of man's anxiety, thrownness, temporality, authenticity. These themes are there, and I will partly deal with some of them. But one of the things I would like to accomplish here is to show that there is something interesting in those areas of Heidegger's thought that are not necessarily existentialist per se, rather than related to it. These other themes involve instead a new kind of world, and I would argue a primordial kind of knowledge of it. I hope to show Heidegger's theory of a non-thematic knowledge of the world, and how man comes to know it in his account of the worldhood of this world, and of our being in it. In this new and hitherto unexplored body of knowledge, it is often said that Heidegger introduces or concentrates on a knowing how rather than a knowing that. I believe this is an understatement, given that at some point Heidegger will explicitly define the worldhood of the world in terms of the wherein of an act of the understanding. I will attempt to show that Heidegger regarded non-thematic knowledge of the world as an awareness of facts, however primordial, however strange a form its disclosedness might take, that makes the world and ourselves intelligible to us. Heidegger proposes a new term for man, which he calls Dasein. From German, this word can be translated as existence, but another element that Heidegger will use extensively is that it is also composed of two separable words, da, meaning there, and sein, which is the infinitive of the verb to be. Some kind of there to be or being there fits in well with Heidegger's project because he envisions Dasein as something that has a there as part of its ontological constitution, that in ontology, the study of being, it is constitutive of Dasein's being to have its there, because for Heidegger, Dasein is always being in the world, never outside of its world. And this fact, he believes, has the significance that an ontological analysis of Dasein must take it into account at the beginning. The basic fact one needs to recognize is that Dasein can be in many ways different from a tree or a hammer. Dasein is aware of its existence, and is the being for whom its existence is an issue, in such a way that Heidegger will argue that existence is Dasein's essence. This is not exactly the same doctrine contained in how Jean-Paul Sartre defines existentialism, by stating that existentialists estiment que l'existence précède le sens, ou, si vous voulez, qu'il faut partir de la subjectivité. Heidegger's thought is compatible with this, in the sense that for him, Dasein's existence is in each case mine, and that Dasein is not just being, but also becoming, in that Dasein projects itself toward a future potentiality for being. In Heidegger's words, we cannot define Dasein's essence by citing a what. Its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be, and has it as its own. This being to which Dasein comports itself, Heidegger calls existenz. He emphasizes Dasein's way of being that comports itself to its existence, rather than the question of what the essence is or when essence exists, as if it were a property of an entity. In the ontological tradition to which Heidegger expresses opposition, the essence of Dasein has also been dealt with by earlier philosophers by attempting to bring out a definition that shows what is different about us from other animals. For Aristotle, it was that man is the rational animal, the one that has reason. In the scholastic period, it took on the religious overtone of Dasein made in his image and likeness. For Descartes in the 17th century, Dasein becomes res cogitans, or thinking thing, after having established an inability to bring his own existence into doubt. In addition, since Descartes, this subject seeking knowledge of its object without direct access had been the dominant theme of epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, continuing into Heidegger's time. Heidegger will argue that there is a fundamental error in ontology steeped in this tradition, and continuing into the 19th century, by virtue of it just never being questioned. He sees two things wrong in the tradition. First, it regards the concept of being as a self-evident and undefinable highest universal that fits no other category. It also creates an unproductive focus on substances and their property. And to get at that, well, in the Western philosophical tradition, a substance is something that can exist on its own, and to which we can attach predicates in order to describe it. In so doing, we attach properties to it, such as color and shape. Among other things, defining something by genus and differentia involves talk of substances and their properties when we define something like man as rational animal. This is done by combining what it has in common with other members of a group or genus, animal in this case, with what makes it different from other members of the group, the differentia, rational. For Heidegger, this focus on substances and their properties causes us to miss the fact that Dasein has a mode of being other than that of substances with present at hand properties. Heidegger's ontology will instead have three modes of being: that of Dasein, and those of the present at hand and the ready to hand. The most descriptively obvious of these is the mode of being present at hand, consisting of just being in Dasein's world with Dasein, without being used or attended to, such as a tree. The ready to hand is the mode of being something that Dasein can use for some purposes, having it in order to, such as a hammer. It will become a theme in Being in Time for Heidegger to object to ontologies of the present at hand that fail to take into account these other modes of being, creating error and confusion in the process. And now that some of these introductory remarks are out of the way, I will get into Dasein as inquirer into being. It is in the introductory section about the formal structure of the question of the meaning of being that Heidegger defines Dasein as the entity that is confronting the question. And he says on what is page 7 of the original, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely being. This entity which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. In doing so, he is explicitly doing two things. First, he is separating Dasein among other entities as being the entity that is doing the questioning. And secondly, he is signaling that an examination of the meaning of the being of this entity that is doing the questioning is to be a starting point in ontology. Heidegger views his predecessors as having left the meaning of being unclear, and his method will involve prioritizing the choice of the being of the inquirer as something to make transparent in his own being. Heidegger marshals three premises to justify his contention that a fundamental ontology, he says, must be sought in the existential analytic of Dasein. The first is that Dasein, rather than being just another entity, is ontically or factually distinguished by the fact that in its being is an issue for it. Dasein, in other words, comports itself to its being on some level, confronts it, and it is characteristic of it to do so, without or prior to any inquiry. The ontical, in Heidegger's terms, signifies concerns with entities and the facts about them, such as in the empirical sciences, rather than the ontological, which concerns itself with the meaning of being. In science, we progress without question of how to interpret the being of what is studied. But outside of science, we can ask about the meaning of being. And thus, Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. The second premise is that in its essence, Dasein having its being to be, and as its own, takes a further form in Dasein always understanding itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibilities to be itself or not itself, in what it chooses, gets itself into, or grows up in already. Whether by taking hold or neglecting, each Dasein decides its existence and the question gets straightened out through existing. These are ways in which Dasein will deal with or take a stance on its being, one way or another. Through and along this existing in this way, the understanding that Dasein gains about itself, Heidegger calls existential as an adjective, or noun-wise, an existentiale. This is an understanding that we obtain without requiring an ontological structure to be theoretically transparent to us. By contrast, the analytic of Dasein will be existential, although it will have its roots in the existential. The third premise is that Dasein also comports itself to entities of a character other than Dasein. It understands those entities, uses these entities for its purposes, and develops sciences. Dasein comports itself to a world with a pre-ontological understanding of being, and conceives of a world in which the being of those entities is accessible. These three premises, that being a Dasein is effectively a condition for making any ontology possible, that it has an ontological nature of having an understanding of itself in terms of its existence, and its ability to ontically comport itself to the being of entities that are not Dasein together make it, more than any other entity, the first to be interrogated. Heidegger does not claim to prove that starting with Dasein is the one and only proper way of doing ontology, but for these reasons it makes sense to him to have Dasein as a starting point. His theory of Dasein's status as the first interrogated entity he calls the ontico-ontological priority of Dasein. And now for being in the world in general. Dasein's world in being in time will be one that is disclosed to it while it is being in the world. This fits in well with Heidegger's methodology of doing phenomenological ontology. In terms of its Greek etymology, phenomenology is a logos, a science or discourse about phenomena. The being of entities will become apparent to us in how they are disclosed or possibly covered up in signs, symptoms, references, etc. In examination of the world, Heidegger will develop a hermeneutic for interpreting, among other things, the meaning of the worldhood of the world. In doing so, as a phenomenology, Heidegger will only seek to explain or interpret the world in which Dasein is, and not draw a distinction between appearance and reality, or between object as conceived of as a content of a perception and object conceived of as existing independently of the perceiver. Or he will also not seek to prove the existence of either. Instead, he argues that it is absurd to even ask the question about the reality of the world. According to him, the question of whether there is a world at all, or whether its being can be proved, makes no sense if it is raised by Dasein as being in the world. And who else would raise it? Accordingly, Heidegger's analysis can still stand or fall in its accuracy, adequacy, consistency, and explanatory power for making our experiences of human existence intelligible. Being in the world is to be understood as a unitary phenomenon for Heidegger. It becomes important especially for his later modes of authenticity and inauthenticity. But for now, I will state that Heidegger at this point wants us to think of being in as something we can expand. The water is in a glass, that is in a room, that is in a city, that is in the world. Though it is a whole, we can still study being in the world in terms of its separate constituents of worldhood, the being of the entity that is a who within it, and being in as such. First, Heidegger starts with a preliminary sketch of being in. What we generally mean by this is a being in something. This is a relationship of being which two entities in space have to each other with regard to their locations in that space. Water and glass are both in the world in the same way. They are entities present at hand, occurring within the world along with each other. Their ontological characteristics are categorical. However, being in is a state of Dasein's being and is an existentiale. It is not to be understood as the being present at hand of a corporeal thing inside another present at hand thing. Being in, for Dasein, has a sense of existing alongside. In German, when I say ich bin, it is connected with by. And similarly in French, je suis is connected with chez. By and chez have a sense of residing or occupying and can be translated as at the place of, whichever Dasein serves as the dative case noun. For Dasein, this being alongside is in a sense of being absorbed in the world as an existentiale. It never means being present at hand together with things. As an example of the difference, Heidegger cites the common expression of a chair touching a wall. He states that, in principle, the chair can never touch the wall, even if the space between them should be equal to zero. He then clarifies this seemingly outrageous statement by pointing out that a wall is never something that a chair can encounter. Because it has being in as its own kind of being, Dasein can be touched in the sense of encountering things because it already has something like a world revealed to it. In this sense, entities present at hand are in themselves worldless. This is an ontological difference to recognize. This also shows the difference between understanding being in as an existentiale and the categorical and existential recognition of the insidedness of one thing in another. Heidegger's world of being and time will be Dasein's absorbed-in world, my term, while he leaves to the sciences the world in which Dasein has mere insidedness. If being in the world is a basic state of Dasein, it must be something that has always been ontically experienced. This knowing the world in some sense must be a founded mode in which being in is exemplified. In other words, Dasein's being in this way must have always been something of which Dasein has awareness on some level, with that awareness as a part of its being. Even if Dasein never sought to formally study itself in this way and gain knowledge of itself as an existentiale. Heidegger believes that this has been superficially grasped by his predecessors in an overly formal manner that created confusion in terms of a problem of knowledge. Subject and object do not coincide with Dasein in the world. Accordingly, we will not here be seeing ourselves as subjects who only have direct access to the mind and its representations, and ask how we are to transcend to objects outside of us and gain knowledge of them that is certain. Instead, we want to obtain phenomenal findings about this knowing, and so Heidegger says we must keep in mind that knowing is grounded beforehand in a being already alongside the world, which is essentially constitutive for Dasein's being. Dasein in its everyday concern will be fascinated by its world. It will direct itself toward entities and grasp them without first getting out of some inner sphere. In doing so, Dasein achieves the status of being toward a world discovered in Dasein itself. And because knowing is founded upon being in the world, the basic state of being in the world must be interpreted beforehand. The three elements of being in the worldhood, the who within it, and being in as such, are the subjects of chapters 3 to 5 in Being and Time. Okay, now for the worldhood of the world, and I will start it with a discussion of the ready to hand. Heidegger starts off his analysis of the world by stating that it is in regard to its structure that being in the world will first be made visible. He cautions against the seemingly easy method of phenomenological description of the being of entities in the world. Nature is itself an entity that can be discovered, but it cannot give us the phenomenon that is the world. There are also things in nature that for us may be invested with value. If we proceed in this manner, the world will have been presupposed. And so Heidegger says that neither the ontical depiction of entities within the world nor the ontological interpretation of their being is such as to reach the phenomenon of the world. Instead, he insists that worldhood is an ontological concept and stands for the structure of one of the constitutive items of being in the world. Worldhood itself is an existential and a characteristic of Dasein itself. Heidegger identifies 4 senses in which the word world can be used, and he only concentrates on 2 of them. Most of the time he will use it in terms of his own definition, that he indicates to have a pre-ontological and existential signification, as that wherein a factical Dasein can be said to live. And this wherein, where a factical Dasein lives, may stand for a public we world or one's own environment. Sometimes he will use the word world to indicate what is commonly meant by most people, the totality of entities that can be present at hand within the world. In those cases, he uses world in single quotes in the text. Heidegger does not want to use the word world to allow for different worlds or wholes within it, even though it can have meaning in this way, such as when we talk about the world of mathematicians. As for a sense of what worldliness is, he will always take the position that it cannot refer to properties of something present at hand. The phenomenon of worldhood, according to Heidegger, is something that gets passed over if we, like his predecessors, fail to see being in the world as a state of Dasein. Such an approach is misguided because it will interpret the world in terms of the being of entities present at hand in nature. Heidegger's approach involves considering the world that is within the horizon of everydayness, because it is the kind of being closest to Dasein. Something like the world comes into view with the study of everyday being in the world, of everyday Dasein. As for a clearer understanding of how this should be, it is important to note how Heidegger deals with the very idea of a meaning of being. We might say trivially that being is that which is, but this doesn't say much. For Heidegger, the meaning of being is something he proposes as what determines an entity as an entity. And thus he wants to connect it with intelligibility that is needed for the determining. And in the introduction, he says at page 6 of the original text, in the question which we are to work out, what is being asked about is being, that which determines entities as entities, that on the basis of which entities are already understood, however we may discuss them in details. The being of entities is not itself an entity. We already have some familiarity with being, and if what is being asked about is what makes entities intelligible to us, instead of how to define them in terms of other entities, an analysis of how a world becomes intelligible to Dasein becomes valuable. And for Heidegger, the totality of equipment will make the world intelligible to Dasein. The world of everyday Dasein that is most easily accessible to it is the environment, and we will seek an ontological interpretation of entities within it. This is seemingly in conflict with Heidegger's earlier statement that an ontological interpretation of entities within the world is not such as to reach the phenomenon of the world. The difference is that Heidegger here will get at the phenomenon of the world through ready-to-hand entities, as they are used by us, rather than through present-at-hand entities ontically studied by us. And the spatial character of the environment will be clarified in terms of the structure of worldhood. Dasein in its everydayness exhibits a concern with the entities within the world when it puts them to use. Our dealings with these other entities Heidegger will take as a clue in terms of a phenomenological interpretation of what Dasein will use or produce. The kind of dealings Dasein has with entities that it uses in its everydayness has its own kind of knowledge, beyond mere perceptual cognition. Dasein already has a preliminary understanding that comes alive in its dealings with entities. The kind of entities Heidegger has in mind are not just any things, but rather those entities which Dasein, in its concern, will relate to as equipment. In our dealings, we come across equipment for writing, sewing, working, transportation, measurement. So we need to define what it is that gives an item its equipmentality. As with wanting to see the world as a totality, Heidegger asserts early on his position that equipment also has to be understood as a totality. Taken strictly, he says, there is no such thing as an equipment. To the being of any equipment, there always belongs a totality of equipment. Those things that Dasein puts to use will have an in order to structure, consisting of an assignment or reference of something to something. Equipment is always in terms of its belonging to other entities that are equipment: pen, ink, paper, desk, lamp, the room. The room emerges closest to us as equipment for residing. An individual item shows itself as equipment only out of this arrangement, the totality of which must have been already discovered. As for investigating the being of equipment, an important statement from Heidegger is that equipment can genuinely show itself only in dealings cut to its own measure. This signifies a number of things. First, it must be the right tool for the job made for that purpose. For instance, a hammer rather than a book for hammering. Second, its manipulability must remain intact. Third, the equipment item must be used in a way that cannot be more suitable. When it works well, an item of equipment will in some sense vanish from our attention and concern. When I consider, for instance, the last doorknob I turned, it seems I paid no attention to it after noticing it being there and grasping it. My concentration was focused instead on opening the door, which is the doorknob's in order to, and of that I had a different kind of sight. However, had the doorknob not work, I probably would have stared at it for a few seconds as if examining its properties. But this is despite the fact that when it did work as planned, I was not acting blindly with it. And of this kind of dealing to measure, Heidegger states at page 69 of the original, in dealings such as this, where something is put to use, our concern subordinates itself to the in order to, which is constitutive for the equipment we are employing at the time. The less we just stare at the hammer thing, and the more we seize hold of it and use it, the more primordial does our relationship to it become, and the more unveiledly it is encountered as that which is, as equipment. The hammering itself uncovers the specific manipulability of the hammer. the kind of being which equipment possesses, in which it manifests itself in its own right, we call Zufriedenheit, or readiness to hand. We can look at objects such as doorknobs and hammers and think about them theoretically, but this is not how we discover the readiness to hand of a thing. Using them has its own kind of sight, and that sight to which the objects accommodate themselves Heidegger calls circumspection. When we deal with equipment, it is always in reference to assignments of in order to. It is true that Dasein cannot use equipment without some theoretical cognition, but certain skill still has its own sight. Rather than being understood theoretically, Heidegger states that the peculiarity of what is proximately ready to hand is that in its readiness to hand, it must, as it were, withdraw in order to be ready to hand quite authentically. We concern ourselves with the work to be done. When all is well with the hammer, it withdraws from the attention of the skilled carpenter. He focuses instead on the toward which of the hammer. The work and the tools for it all exist in a broader context. In the work itself, there is reference or assignment to materials, and some of those materials may be natural, such as leather from hides. And along with animals that reproduce themselves, there are also metals and wood that are materials for a tool, such as a hammer. So certain entities in the environment are ready to hand but need to be produced. In equipment that is used, a nature is discovered in terms of what we find in the material products, although it is not the same nature as in the power of nature. The work that is produced refers not only to the toward which of its usability and the material of which it consists, but also to the assignment to the person who is to use or wear it. Even when a product is not cut to measure for a particular Dasein, is produced in large quantities, the constitutive assignment is no less there, just indefinite. Therefore, along with the work, we discover other Daseins who, in their concern, the product of the work becomes ready to hand, be it a well-tailored suit or a house in which he can reside. Their world is the same as ours, and so we also with it discover a public world, and an environing nature that is accessible to all Daseins. Another reason to include nature here is that sometimes something is built to take nature into account, such as street lighting and covered railway platforms. The kind of being belonging to these entities is readiness to hand. The characteristic of readiness to hand is not to be taken as an aspect of an entity, or that the entity is given subjective coloring. Yet Heidegger tells us only by reason of something present at hand is there anything ready to hand. Readiness to hand is the way in which entities are, as they are in themselves, are defined ontologico-categorically, because something of the present at hand that can be scientifically studied still remains in those entities that we are ontologically interpreting. Okay, now for some talk about circumspection and assignments. A world that has worldliness has still not yet announced itself in what we have so far. Among other things, we may note at this point that the same object has present at hand properties and sometimes becomes ready to hand. So far, what has been shown is that the ready to hand must be understood in terms of the totality of equipment in an environment. Now we need to look at how the worldly character of that environment announces itself. Certain modes of concern belong to everyday being in the world. This permits the entities with which we are concerned to be encountered in such a way that the worldly character of what is in the world can come to the fore. So far we have discovered that authentic readiness to hand, such as when the hammer withdraws, allows circumspection to be focused on the in order to. But the skilled carpenter's focus could return to the hammer as a present-at-hand object if it becomes unusable, such as if the head detaches itself from the handle. When a piece of equipment becomes unusable, Heidegger says about it on page 73 of the original, we discover its unusability. However, not by looking at it and establishing its properties, but rather by the circumspection of the dealings in which we use it. When its unusability is thus discovered, equipment becomes conspicuous. This conspicuousness presents the ready-to-hand equipment as in a certain unreadiness to hand. But this implies that what cannot be used just lies there. It shows itself as an equipmental thing, which looks so-and-so, and which, in its readiness to hand, as looking that way, has constantly been present at hand too. It becomes pure presence at hand, while still not devoid of all readiness to hand, in the sense that concern can still relate to it if it is put back in usable condition. There are three ways in which equipment can lose its readiness to hand. These modes are conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. These modes all bring to the fore the presence at hand in the ready-to-hand. In our concernful dealings, we may find out not only that something might be unusable or conspicuous because it is broken, but also that something is not handy because it is missing. When something is not even at hand, it thereby enters the mode of obtrusiveness, and the more urgently it is needed, the more obtrusive it becomes. Obtrusiveness is the being just present at hand of the ready-to-hand. In addition to being unusable or lost, a piece of equipment may stand in the way of our concern. Our concern has no time for it, does not want to attend to it, and it is something unready to hand in the sense of what does not belong. In the obstinacy of what we must concern ourselves with before anything else, the presence at hand of the ready-to-hand makes itself known in the unwelcome call to our attention. In the modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy, as presence at hand makes itself known, readiness to hand is still understood, although not in a thematic way. Even as it bids us farewell into the unusable, Heidegger tells us readiness to hand still shows itself. And it is precisely here that the worldly character of the ready-to-hand shows itself too. But why should the ready-to-hand reveal worldly character precisely when an item is unusable, especially given what was said before about the ready-to-hand having an in order to, and it being authentically ready-to-hand when it withdraws and lets us focus on the toward which? The being of what is ready to hand as equipment is determined by references or assignments. When equipment cannot be used, its in order to gets disturbed, and so too does the assignment. The assignment becomes explicit because as the assignment becomes frustrated, our concern is aroused in a way that brings the assignment to our attention. And thus Heidegger concludes on page 74 and 75 of the original. When an assignment to some particular towards this has been thus circumspectively aroused, we catch sight of the towards this itself, and along with it everything connected with the work. The whole workshop as that wherein concern always dwells. The context of equipment is lit up, not as something never seen before, but as a totality constantly cited beforehand in circumspection. With this totality, however, the world announces itself. One example from Heidegger about how this works is that when an item is missing, our circumspection comes up against emptiness and sees what the missing item was ready to hand with and ready to hand for. A conclusion he draws from this is that the world does not consist of the ready to hand. The ready to hand gets deprived of its worldliness when its being just present at hand comes to the fore. To use my own example, if the pencil sharpener breaks, it calls to my attention the whole purposes of pencil and paper, as well as the particular task for which I was using them and the purpose I was trying to accomplish in doing that task. The negative mode brings to light what was there in the positive modes, from the origin of the object that becomes unready to hand and has lost its worldliness. By contrast, in the positive mode, when an item is working, the world announcing itself in the totality of assignments makes it possible for the ready to hand to emerge from inconspicuousness. Heidegger concludes that it is in this that the being in itself of entities which are ready to hand has its phenomenal structure constituted. In circumspective concern, whenever the ready to hand entities within the world were accessible, the world had already been disclosed beforehand. When Heidegger describes in this context a totality, or the world, as disclosed, he means to indicate disclosed only in the sense of being laid open, rather than it being something obtained indirectly by an inference. He also insists that Dasein as an entity was already in that world, with some familiarity with it through its being in the world. He summarizes what we have so far by stating that being in the world amounts to a non-thematic circumspective absorption in references or assignments, constitutive for the readiness to hand of a totality of equipment. In order to better understand this, we now turn to the nature of those references and assignments that allow for the readiness to hand of equipment. We start again with the being of the ready to hand, focusing now on signs as equipment. We come across equipment in signs which, as pieces of equipment, can do a job of showing or indicating. In the case of a car's turn signal, it is ready to hand for the concern of not just the driver alone. It exists within an equipment context of vehicles and traffic regulations, although it has its own in order to in terms of indicating. However, as to its ontological structure, Heidegger states that the indicating which the sign performs can be taken as a kind of referring. But we must notice that this referring as indicating is not the ontological structure of the sign as equipment. Referring as indicated is grounded in the being structure of equipment in serviceability for. A hammer has serviceability for without being a sign, while the sign has serviceability for indicating. The serviceability of the turn signal is only within the totality of a traffic system that had to be understood beforehand. The indicating as a reference makes the toward which of the turn signal's serviceability ontically concrete. This kind of reference through indicating, Heidegger says, is an ontological categorical attribute of equipment as equipment. Equipment for indicating just gets used in a special way. What a sign indicates is addressed to Dasein as a way of behaving in an appropriate way having to do with signs. The sign is not otherwise grasped if we just stare at it as an indicator thing. It is an address to circumspective concern, which in the case of an arrow might only be to get an orientation within an environment. Ultimately, a sign is what Heidegger calls a native of equipment, which explicitly raises a totality of equipment into our circumspection, so that the worldly character of the ready-to-hand announces itself. This applies to the manifold types of signs, including a symptom of what is coming. In establishing a sign, the peculiar character of signs as equipment becomes clear. It requires a foresight and an environment capable of announcing itself for circumspection by means of something ready to hand. A piece of ready-to-hand equipment then does the work of letting something ready to hand become conspicuous. Previously, the conspicuousness of the ready-to-hand was what happened when a piece of equipment became unready to hand, by being broken, for instance. But here the sign making another object conspicuous means that it is set up for accessibility, rather than becoming randomly present at hand. When someone takes as a sign something already ready to hand, the sign gets established in a more primordial way, such as when a farmer takes the south wind as a sign of rain. If functioning as a warning signal this way, by circumspection, a ready-to-hand equipment totality, an environment, or both, can be given an availability that is circumspectively oriented. It can be something that reveals. Heidegger is here allowing for instances of inference where primitive man may have interpreted nature as having signs, but not always, where today we generally do not. He does not believe we are in a position to explain the being ready to hand in the more primitive world through a study of its fetishism and magic. His interpretation of primitive man's taking something as a sign is something he explains on page 82. He says, with regard to the sign phenomenon, the following interpretation may be given. For primitive man, the sign coincides with that which is indicated. Not only can the sign represent this in the sense of serving as a substitute for what it indicates, but it can do so in such a way that the sign itself always is what it indicates. This remarkable coinciding does not mean, however, that the sign thing has already undergone a certain objectification, that it has been experienced as a mere thing and misplaced into the same realm of being of the present at hand as what it indicates. This coinciding is not an identification of things which have hitherto been isolated from each other. It consists rather in the fact that the sign has not as yet become free from that of which it is a sign. To make my own example of what he's talking about, perhaps primitive man may have seen lightning, as we see it today, not as a sign of coming thunder, but as a different manifestation of the same thing. This would be correct because thunder is the sound of the lightning, and because sound does not travel as fast as light, the thunder will come afterward. The two are not objectified as different things. Heidegger's interpretation of the phenomenon of the sign is meant to support his analysis of references and assignments. References and assignments are not themselves signs or ontical characteristics of something ready to hand, and the references cannot be part of the foundations of a sign. He sees a sign as in a relation with reference in three ways. First, the sign is an indicating that functions as a way for it toward which its serviceability to become concrete, founded upon the in order to. So I want to change lanes into the left lane in anticipation of making a left turn up ahead. I hit that turn signal, towards which is the blinking of the lights on the back of the car in order to signal the Dasein behind me of my intention to change lanes. Secondly, this indicating is an equipmental character of something ready to hand, belonging to the totality of equipment. And in this case, it also belongs to a totality of traffic regulations, in which I hope the Dasein behind me understands that if he wants to pass me, he should wait until I make the lane change and pass me on the right. Third, in the readiness to hand of the sign, the environment becomes explicitly accessible for circumspection, which is why I expect the Dasein to understand all of this behind me. And so Heidegger summarizes the sign as something ontically ready to hand, which functions both as this definite equipment and as something indicative of the ontological structure of readiness to hand, and of referential totalities, and of worldhood. Now for the freeing of entities and the structure of worldhood. We can summarize at this point what Heidegger is doing with the worldhood of the world. He views the world as something of which we have a primordial understanding. It must have already been discovered, but not thematically. His holistic approach involves readiness to hand having an ontological relationship to the world. It allows some otherwise merely present at hand entities that have readiness to hand to operate as what displays worldhood as an existentiale. It is the world that is what, in terms of which the ready to hand can become ready to hand. As an existentiale, it is something within Dasein that allows for Dasein to understand it in a different, non-thematic way. In this way, through its circumspective dealings, objects in the world of Dasein that are lit up for him can be freed for his concernful circumspection. The hammer is freed in some sense, in that it becomes free to be what it ontologically is, namely equipment for hammering. Entities that have the kind of being of readiness to hand need to be freed for our circumspection, because the indicating of the sign and the hammering of the hammer are not properties of entities. Instead, it must have the character of having been assigned or referred. And so Heidegger talks about this in particular on page 84. But what then is reference or assignment to mean? To say that the being of the ready to hand has the structure of assignment or reference means that it has in itself the character of having been assigned or referred. An entity is discovered when it has been assigned or referred to something, and referred as that entity which it is. With any such entity, there is an involvement which it has in something. The character of being which belongs to the ready to hand is just such an involvement. If something has an involvement, this implies letting it be involved in something. The relationship of the with, in, shall be indicated by the term assignment or reference. This is why we can imagine that if a violent thunderstorm at sea washes a hammer upon the shore of an uncharted island, natives who do not practice hammering may not grasp what use it has for us, and may put it to a different use, as a weapon, or to peel off bark off trees with the claw end, or to break and uproot plants. This would be a different assignment and totality of involvements. But either way, when that entity has been freed, its being has its involvement. It is ontologically definitive for the ready to hand to have that involvement. A hammer is involved in hammering, which is in turn involved in making something that is involved in building shelter for Dasein, for instance. It is to be understood in terms of a totality of involvements, in which the entire workshop is earlier than any single item of equipment. Ultimately, this will point back to an original towards which, but that original towards which cannot be an entity with a kind of being other than Dasein. The original for the sake of can only pertain to the being of Dasein, because a for the sake of which an involvement exists is a being for whom its being is an issue and takes a stance on its being. Ontically, when we let something be involved, it means that within our factical concern, we let something ready to hand be so and so as it is already. Ontologically, it consists in having been previously freed for its readiness to hand in the environment. It is freed in terms of the in which and the with which of its involvement. And so what we have so far is that Dasein assigns itself to an in order to in terms of a potentiality for being, that for the sake of which Dasein itself is. If involvements point to Dasein's purposes, then it makes sense that Dasein will be that for which the ready to hand is freed. Heidegger expresses this as Dasein assigning itself from a for the sake of which to the with which of an involvement. Dasein lets entities be encountered as ready to hand for its purposes through an act of understanding. In other words, Dasein understands itself as assigning itself to be the that for which it lets entities be encountered. What is involved in the involvement of the ready to hand is the towards which of serviceability and the for which of usability, understood in terms of the totality of involvements. Heidegger's world and worldhood will be a tie-in of a where-in with purposes that will create a holistic view of the world made up of a totality of relations in the understanding of Dasein. And so Heidegger will give a definition of the world and worldhood in terms of what he talks about on page 86 of the original, where he says, Dasein always assigns itself from a for the sake of which to the with which of an involvement. That is to say, to the extent that it is, it always lets entities be encountered as ready to hand. That wherein Dasein understands itself beforehand, wherein as if it were a noun, that wherein Dasein understands itself beforehand, in the mode of assigning itself, is that for which it has let entities be encountered beforehand. The wherein of an act of understanding which assigns or refers itself is that for which one lets entities be encountered in the kind of being that belongs to involvements. And this wherein is the phenomenon of the world. And the structure of that to which Dasein assigns itself is what makes up the worldhood of the world. Dasein is already primordially familiar with this wherein or world, and does not require that the various relations be theoretically transparent. This familiarity, however, serves as a ground for an ontological or existential interpretation of the relations. In Dasein's assigning itself, it will give itself both its being and potentiality for being to be understood with regard to its being in the world. In signifying, Dasein gives itself its being in the world as something to be understood. This is because a primordial totality of involvements are bound in the relationships where Heidegger tells us The "for the sake of which" signifies an "in order to," this in turn a "towards which," the latter an "in which" of a letting something be involved, and that in turn the "with which" of an involvement. This relational totality of significance makes up the structure and is the worldhood of the world. Okay, now for some discussion about the Cartesian world in contrast. For greater clarity in contrast, as well as to provide a critique, Heidegger wishes at this point to contrast his theory of the world with a commonly accepted view of René Descartes of the world made up of extended objects and thinking things. For Heidegger, the interpretation of the world begins with some entity within it, namely Dasein. Descartes uses extension as ontologically definitive for the world. Descartes' distinction between nature and spirit is rooted in his distinction between res corporea and ego cogito, extended corporeal things, and the I that thinks. The being of an entity itself is substantia, in the form of substantiality, and sometimes an entity a substance. Substances are known through their attributes, with many having a property from which their essences can be discerned. For res corporea, the corporeal thing, that essence is extension. Even though extension can undergo changes in shape and distribution, extension will remain constitutive of the entity. All else presupposes extension. Hardness, weight, color can be taken away and it remains what it is. The being of res corporea is what remains throughout the changes. In any corporeal thing, the real entity is what is suited to remain constant throughout the changes, and that is how the substantiality of a substance is to be characterized. What makes up the being of an extended thing is extension. According to Heidegger, this idea of extension is tied up with an unclear idea of substantiality that has yet to be resolved. There remains a question of the meaning of being that substantiality embraces. The being of a substance is characterized as not needing any other entity to be. In this sense, the only real substance is God, yet the schoolmen still wanted real created substances. The two are alike as entities, but because God is infinite being, the difference between them is infinite. Descartes instead declares that the name substance is not appropriate to God and also to these univocally. That is, he says, no significance of this name, which would be common to both God and his creation, can be distinctly understood. Heidegger states that ultimately Descartes has characterized being as inaccessible, and that Emmanuel can't follow him in declaring being to not be a predicate. Heidegger at some points declares Descartes to be evading the ontological question of substantiality. I believe the text indicates Heidegger is not giving Descartes proper credit for being critical of the school tradition in the very quotes Heidegger uses, but this is not what is most important. Heidegger still has a point that ontological grounds for defining objects in the world as res extensa are unclear at best and based on a confusion of the factual and the ontological. It lies in the idea of substantiality, and he says of it on page 94, the ontological grounds for defining the world as res extensa have been made plain. They lie in the idea of substantiality, which not only remains unclarified in the meaning of its being, but gets passed off as something incapable of clarification, and gets represented indirectly by way of whatever substantial property belongs most preeminently to the particular substance. Moreover, in this way of defining substance, through some substantial entity, lies the reason why the term substance is used in two ways. What is here intended is substantiality, and it gets understood in terms of a characteristic of substance, a characteristic which is itself an entity. Now, what all this ends up meaning, I think, is that when we define substance through an entity, our intention was to define substantiality. And that substantiality then gets understood as a characteristic of the substance itself, which is itself the entity. But as stated before, the being of an entity is not itself an entity. And here something ontical is made to underlie the ontological. Heidegger's objection to Descartes' procedure is ultimately that we do not obtain proper access to the being of a thing through present-at-hand thingness alone. When the being of an object in the world is extension, our only access can be knowledge of the type obtained through mathematics and the physical sciences. This is well suited to entities that always are what they are, and what enduringly remains is extension. Where the real being is the constant present at hand, it does not permit the entities within the world to present themselves to us phenomenologically. As we have seen for Heidegger, the world shows itself through the ready-to-hand. Descartes cannot even explain the ready-to-hand in terms of what it means to be a hammer if the essence of it is tied up with extension, or if it is essentially a modification of the extension of its material. Descartes treats man-made objects as having no significant ontological difference to something present at hand. In addition, the idea of the world consisting of the permanently present at hand to be discovered through a mathematical model prevents Descartes from bringing Dasein's way of behaving into view, and from bringing into light the phenomenon of Dasein's concern in dealing with the totality of the ready-to-hand. So far, this is an interpretational objection, an argument from lack of breadth of explanatory power. But Heidegger also adds an epistemological argument about drawing inferences about being from sense experience. He says Descartes knew very well that entities do not show themselves in their real being. What is proximally given is the waxen thing, which is colored, flavored, hard and cold, in different definite ways. This is not of any importance ontologically, nor in general as anything given through the senses. Here, more than at any point, is where Heidegger will make a concrete Heideggerian epistemology, or theory of knowledge, of the kind of knowledge of the world that his predecessors did not explore. His justification will be that he takes the being of the perceiving Dasein into account, and can explain the world better in terms of how it becomes intelligible to us. Heidegger now gives an argument specifically that Descartes' idea of hardness and resistance, underlying his theory of extension, does not allow the being of entities to come to the fore. Hardness gets taken as resistance, a not yielding a place and undergoing no change of location. Where a thing resists, it will remain in a definite location relative to some other thing that does change its location and may catch up with it. Heidegger says that when the experience of hardness is interpreted this way, the kind of being that belongs to sensory perception is obliterated, and so is the possibility that the entities encountered in such perception should be grasped in their being. This can remind us of what was said earlier about a chair never touching a wall, even if the space between them should be equal to zero. In some sense, a chair cannot touch anything because its being does not have the character of Dasein. Thus, when Descartes does not take into account the kind of being that engages in sensory perception, he says the perception of something becomes a definite way of being present at hand side by side of two res extensi, which are themselves present at hand. Descartes is missing that what can be felt by touching is not complete, hardness not showing itself at all, without something living, at least if not having the character of Dasein. Descartes thus limited the kinds of access to entities within the world, because the type of knowledge of entities within the world that he sought was only the ontical and the categorical. And now for the subject of spatiality. Earlier it was seen that for Heidegger, Dasein's being in is to be understood as an existentialer and not as the insidedness of one present at hand thing inside another. Yet space still exists for Dasein. For Heidegger, there are ultimately different ways of being in space. Dasein's spatiality is where the contrast between the world of Heidegger and those of his predecessors more clearly comes to the fore. It will be related to Dasein's circumspection. The spatiality of something ready to hand has yet to be grasped as a phenomenon. What is proximally ready to hand has the character of closeness, already implied by its readiness to hand. Every entity will have its own circumspective closeness that is not measured by calculating physical distances. When an item of equipment has also been given directionality, it has been set up and it is in its place. It is not merely in a position in space as something present at hand. Its place is a there of some item of equipment that belongs somewhere. As part of a totality of equipment, its place will be allotted in relation to that totality. The whither that makes it possible for an item to belong somewhere is what Heidegger calls the region. Regions are how space gets split up into different spaces. The sun will be in different positions at different times, resulting in changes in its usefulness for us. The celestial region provides its whither. The way a house is divided into rooms is in terms of their character as equipment. A region's readiness to hand has the character of inconspicuous familiarity, in a more primordial sense than does the being of the ready to hand. We often pay no attention to the room or the tool shed. As regions, they become visible in a deficient mode of readiness to hand, such as when an item of equipment is missing. When a tool is missing from the shed as a region becomes conspicuous. What gets revealed here is the spatiality of that space belonging to the world. It is disclosed as not being a world previously divided into different spaces, except by means of circumspection, although space still retains its ontical unity as one all-encompassing space that we divide. And Heidegger says of this spatiality on page 104 of the original, the space which is discovered and circumspected being in the world, as the spatiality of the totality of equipment, always belongs to entities themselves as the place of that totality. The bare space itself is still veiled over. Space has been split up into places. But this spatiality has its own unity through that totality of involvements, in accordance with the world which belongs to the spatially ready to hand. The environment does not arrange itself in a space which has been given in advance, but its specific worldhood, in its significance, articulates the context of involvements which belongs to some current totality of circumspectively allotted places. And thus a region becomes allotted out of a present at hand broader space, and in that totality as itself is ready to hand. This dividing or dissevering of space will be part of Dasein's being. Insofar as we attribute space to Dasein, in this way, it must be conceived in terms of the kind of being Dasein has. Dasein's spatiality cannot be like the occurrence of something in a position, because Dasein's concern has it dealing with entities within the world. Dasein's spatiality will have disseverance and directionality. As with the nature of the ready-to-hand as authentically so, when it in some sense vanishes, disseverance will consist in making farness vanish, or remoteness disappear through circumspection. And for Heidegger, this is not done by reducing the distance between two things by moving them. Proximally and for the most part, dissevering is a circumspective bringing close, in a sense of putting something ready to hand. Part of Heidegger's argument for this relates to remoteness never being taken by us as an estimated distance. Instead, in Dasein's everydayness, he says we say that to go over yonder is a good walk, a stone's throw, or as long as it takes to smoke a pipe. And this shows that if farness is to be estimated, this is done relatively to disseverances, in which everyday Dasein maintains itself. For Dasein, in his concernful circumspection, using disseverance to conquer remoteness, will be for the making of something authentically ready to hand. In Dasein lies an essential tendency toward a closeness that does not coincide with and may contradict the objective distance between things that are present at hand, as measured by a ruler or a tape. An example of this is spectacles worn for vision. As a piece of equipment sitting on my nose, very distantly close, it vanishes in its readiness to hand and becomes environmentally more remote than the painting on the opposite wall. And so Heidegger states that that which is presumably closest is by no means that which is at the smallest distance from us. When we bring closeness to objects, they become, through our concern, something brought toward concernful being. According to Heidegger, it is in this way, and only in thus coming before us, is the current world authentically ready to hand. Dasein's circumspective dissevering also reveals the being in itself of a true world, of that entity that Dasein is alongside. Now, one who wants to orient himself toward nature in objectively measured distances might want to pass this off as subjectivist. And Heidegger wants to defend himself against this. He says that this subjectivism, if that's what it is, uncovers the reality of the world at its most real. And this is because the dissevering in Dasein's everydayness reveals a true world that Dasein is already alongside. Dasein's being in has already been referred to by Heidegger as an alongsidedness. And so if this is subjectivism, it therefore would not be one that takes something as being other than what it is, or what one wishes it to be, but potentially one that finds it even involuntarily. It is when circumspective concern determines the closeness or remoteness of what is environmentally ready to hand then a primordial spatiality of being in becomes available, and it would be otherwise concealed by concern directed exclusively at measured distances. As being in the world, Dasein maintains itself in dissevering. The closeness it creates to the ready-to-hand object can never be reduced to zero. As Dasein approaches an object like a hammer, the distance itself between the two becomes dissevered. Being spatial in this way is part of Dasein's being. And so Heidegger says, Dasein is spatial in that it discovers space circumspectively, so that it indeed constantly comports itself disseverantly toward the entities thus spatially encountered. Circumspection also gives Dasein directionality in terms of the whither that is indicated by signs as well as the directions left and right. Directionality thus belongs to disseverance and is founded upon being in the world. Heidegger says that this is shown by the fact that merely the feeling of my two sides left and right is sufficient to orient myself in the world. He borrows an example from Kant of a familiar but dark room in which I do not see that left and right are now switched as a result of objects being rearranged. Kant interprets this situation wherein there is an I that has memory. According to Heidegger, this does also allude to an existentially constitutive state of being in the world. Kant simply wanted to show that an orientation requires a subjective a priori principle. For Heidegger, left and right are a subjective a priori principle of being in the world. In a way, it is fitting that Heidegger chooses to put his discussion of spatiality right after his critique of Descartes' vision of the world. Heidegger will now claim that only his explication of spatiality can do what he calls the working out of the world's spatiality and formulating the ontological problem of space. His argument seeks to show that without what I will call his circumspective space, first being intelligible, what I call his nature space would otherwise itself be inconceivable. In isolation, it is by the narrowness of the concepts applied to it that nature space looks definitive in the nature of its being. Section 24 starts with a paragraph, of which there are many in Being and Time, where Heidegger makes use of Kant's method of transcendental argument. And what I mean by this is an argument that this item that we take to be real is only possible due to that other item already being there. Such a statement is characterizable or symbolizable as P if only Q, or if not Q then not P, which will allow us to argue that Q must be true once we establish P. Heidegger himself refers to Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason as having provided an explanation of how there can be a nature. A famous example in the Critique of Pure Reason is that to have a world of perceived objects that is law-governed in one consciousness, among other things, it must be possible for the I think to accompany all my representations. In Being and Time, one of the numerous examples is that a totality of involvements for what is ready to hand must have already been discovered, although not thematically. As he goes on in Being and Time, Heidegger uses this style to summarize and introduce new topics at many points, although the purposes of the two books are starkly different. Heidegger will reward the careful reader who keeps track of his terms and what he means by them with these arguments in summary, where he explicitly reasons in this way. And what is in section 24? Well, at any one time, Dasein has already dissevered a world in the sense of a totality of things. This is founded upon the worldhood of the world in terms of entities freed for the totality of involvements. The regions show a previous understanding of significance for referring and assigning that allows for something to be freed and involved. We have seen that Dasein is spatial. To free a totality of involvements, we let something be involved in a region by means of disseverance and directionality. Therein lies a co-disclosedness of the worldhood of the world with space, but it is a space that still lacks three-dimensionality. In the region, nature's space remains hidden because it is a referential totality dissevered beforehand in Dasein. The region has the character of a totality of involvements of the ready-to-hand, which therein belong when dissevered and given directionality. When we encounter entities in a way that is constitutive for our being in the world, we give them space and make room for them. And Heidegger describes this process on page 111 of the original. He says, when we let entities within the world be encountered in the way which is constitutive for being in the world, we give them space. This giving space, which we also call making room for them, consists in freeing the ready-to-hand for its spatiality. As a way of discovering and presenting a possible totality of spaces determined by involvements, this making room is what makes possible one's factical orientation at the time. In concerning itself circumspectively with the world, Dasein can move things around or out of the way or make room for them, only because making room, understood as an existentiality, belongs to its being in the world. It is on this basis of the potentiality of being in the world that space is accessible for cognition. In other words, the reason why we are capable of understanding nature's space is due to our experiences with circumspective space. Through being in the world, nature's space is discovered. This claim of Heidegger's is based on the idea that it is through involvements of the ready-to-hand objects, assignments and regions, that spatiality becomes intelligible to Dasein. All this Dasein does as a being that is ontologically spatial. And Heidegger tells us further, also on page 111, the space is not to be found in the subjects. Nope. Nor does the subject observe the world as if that world were in space. But the subject, the Dasein, if well understood ontologically, is spatial. And because Dasein is spatial in the way we have described, space shows itself as a priori. This term does not mean anything like previously belonging to a subject which is proximally still worldless and which emits a space out of itself. Here, a priority means the previousness with which space has been encountered as a region, whenever the ready-to-hand is encountered environmentally. Dasein always has space presented as already discovered, although not thematically. We are capable of conceiving of space as in the homogeneous space of nature, although in doing so, spatiality and the ready-to-hand lose their character as a part of involvement. Spatiality of nature becomes merely the context of things that are present at hand and deprives the ready-to-hand of its worldhood. As for the being of space as thing itself, although not a res, as in res extensa and res cogitans, as a thing itself, he suggests that the problematic needs more interpretation under a broader set of concepts to illustrate its conceivably various possibilities. We have now completed Heidegger's worldhood of the world, and I will go on to some critical comments that will segue into the who within. But before I do that, I'm going to point out that if you're still with me, not only are those like and subscribe buttons are available to you, you could also click on Philosopher out there to check out my channel page and my other videos. Of Heidegger's biggest claims in Being and Time, his theory about spatiality may be argued to be the least clear and least defensible. What is clear in his exposition is that he wants to have a kind of primacy of circumspective space over nature space. Can he have the claim that nature space, of objective measurements, being inconceivable without circumspective space being first understood through involvements? Is he putting the cart before the horse? It seems to me that he cannot have it, and is inconsistent precisely because he has circumspective space and its worldhood so heavily connected to the ready-to-hand. I see this playing out in two ways. The first and most obvious is that for Dasein to conceive of a ready-to-hand object as not me, I would suspect that Dasein must first have a pre-ontological understanding of space, just as it would have a pre-ontological understanding of being. Heidegger lays claim to the pre-ontological understanding of being, but not the pre-ontological understanding of space, and this despite the fact that he claims that being in has the character of being alongside. Secondly, Heidegger seems to be missing the full significance of the fact that ready-to-hand objects are Dasein invented. Even if he wants to speak only of today's having a world disclosed to it through what is given at this time, it is still true that Dasein may make hammers or new equipment inventions and must determine size and shape. There can also be new combinations of ready-to-hand inventions, such as a nail gun that may be used by professionals but not by the hobbyist. Heidegger's tripping step here is the idea that an item of equipment can only be authentically ready to hand when it is, in his own words, cut to its own measure. This would not just apply to the original inventor, but also to any Dasein that modifies an item of equipment or uses it in different sizes to make it cut to its own measure for different uses. This seems to imply that readiness to hand, and thus circumspective space discovered through it, is only conceivable because a nature space has been previously disclosed. This may be considered part of a problem Heidegger later admitted in his analysis that it lacked historicity. Being in Time is concerned with an attempt to paint the picture of all applicable to Dasein, conceivably of all times as well as universally across the globe, with little to say about more primitive Dasein. He may, however, have been able to present a more cogent argument for a softer conclusion in favor of a pre-ontological understanding of space as part of Dasein's being in. He does say that because Dasein is spatial, space shows itself as a priori, although he means something a little bit different from that. But it strikes me as a better argument for this. He seems to have wanted a greater contrast and more substantial rejection of Descartes' vision by attacking his idea of space and extension as such, rather than just sticking to the pattern of it only explaining the world in the terms of the present at hand. But it's debatable to me that he needed to go that far. As for a critical analysis of Heidegger's readiness to hand and his theory that it makes the world come to light for Dasein, I've already previously mentioned the lack of treatment of original invention and the question of historicity. Within these limits, I believe it can be argued that Heidegger's analysis is very strong in its explanatory power of how Dasein comes to understand his world, and how it is by a cognition that is different from that of a mathematical analysis or theoretical physics. Personally, I have had the experience of having a bowling ball slip out of my grip on the backswing. In that moment, the right hand comes down toward the foul line with no immediate awareness that it is empty. I stared at the empty hand, wondering what happened. It doesn't take a long time, but there is that lag before realizing what has happened, no matter how obvious the inference. Upon gaining awareness of the situation, the realization is that a present at hand and heavy object may fall on my head, and it was cringing with my arms over my head that I heard the ball crash onto the floor behind me. Heidegger was correct in his prediction implicit in what he says, that I was paying no attention to the ball on the upswing when it was authentically ready to hand. I was focusing on the in order to of the ball to knock down the pins. Upon seeing the empty hand, the entire totality of my body, the lane on both sides of the foul line, the pins, and the ball, was lit up in the failure mode of the ball becoming obtrusive, in it not being at hand. I would defend Heidegger's account of this becoming conscious of a world when it is the world of one's time and place into which one is born, or in his language, thrown. For Heidegger, readiness to hand is possible due to another necessary condition as part of Dasein's being. I learned to first operate a hammer, however clumsily at first, by my father teaching me. There are many other tricks I learned along the way in operating equipment, such as automatic and manual doors, eating and dressing habits. The mystery of the barber pole and the line of rollers at the beer store also shows how fascinated with the world Dasein can be. Just as the that for which of the ready to hand points to a shared world of other Daseins, so too does it imply, as a necessary condition, a set of shared social practices. As a child, I learned also that likewise my father and the fathers of other children also came to participate in the shared practices. Now we may recall what was stated earlier, that being in the world, despite being a unitary phenomenon, can be examined in its three parts of being in, the worldliness of the world, and the who that Dasein is being. The totality of equipment and these shared social practices all point to a Das Man, which is a non-physical they, or a what one does. That is the subject of Heidegger's analysis of the who that Dasein is, proximally and for the most part. As part of its being in the world, Dasein will also have a being with, as a Dasein relating to other Daseins, and also a Dasein with, as another Dasein for the others to be being with. Heidegger tells us that it is this being that Dasein is in its everydayness, and the who that it will be most of the time, the Dasein that has being with and Dasein with. This will later lead to issues of authenticity, because this is despite the fact that the existence of Dasein is in each case mine. Nevertheless, it is to the world of the time and place of a particular Dasein that Heidegger's analysis is to apply, I think, despite the fact that Heidegger writes this book as if it were a formula that applies the same way for all Dasein universally. It is universally true that each Dasein has its particular time and place. Heidegger does not presuppose these inventions and social practices in his treatment of being and time. I don't think he does. As such, with these caveats, I think it is a strong analysis of a world that becomes intelligible to Dasein in the way that Dasein relates to it. I also believe I've shown that in the phenomenon of the worldhood of the world, for Heidegger, it shows itself in many ways to be a non-thematic understanding that Dasein gains. Stronger proof of this comes from the similarities between relating to the ready-to-hand and relating to other Daseins, as well as in the existential constitution of the there into which Dasein is thrown. And now on to the subject of Dasein with. The Cartesian I provides only a framework for a phenomenology of consciousness, due to it being a reflective awareness. The found givenness of the I, therefore, cannot be our starting point if we are to arrive at the who that Dasein is in a way that is phenomenologically adequate. A bare object without a world is never given, and an isolated I without others is not far from it. Only in existing in the world is Dasein itself. Yet, at the same time, this Dasein is, in each case, mine. It may seem, therefore, that the who that Dasein is must be and at the same time cannot be this I. To find this hidden who, Heidegger proposes a clue in Dasein's essence as grounded in its existence. And so he states that if the I is an essential characteristic of Dasein, then it is one which must be interpreted existentially. Accordingly, we are to exhibit phenomenally the kind of being that Dasein possesses. If we are hesitant about letting the way of being constitute the self that we seek, Heidegger says this apprehension is only rooted in what he calls the perverse assumption that the entity in question has at bottom the kind of being which belongs to something present at hand. In describing the environment, we have equipment that refers to others for whom the work is done. Previously, we had the ready-to-hand and nature that is present at hand. The Dasein of others, however, must be different from either. Other Daseins are encountered in the world, but are in it by way of their being in the world. By others, Heidegger does not mean an everyone else but me against an I that stands out. For the most part, one distinguishes himself in terms of what he also is, and his Auch-Dasein, or being there too, does not consist in being present at hand with them in the world. The with and the to, understood existentially rather than categorically, creates a circumspectively concernedful being in the world. We are concerned with each other. In this way, a with world becomes a Mitwelt that I share with others whom I encounter environmentally. Even if others become a theme for study, they are not encountered as person things present at hand. Instead, we use being with as a mutual disclosure of each other, as that being for which the other is freed within the world. Dasein is essentially being with as an existential characteristic of Dasein, even when factically no other is present or perceived. The negative mode of being alone is still mit Dasein in the world, being with in the world. It is a characteristic of one's own Dasein and characterizes the Dasein of the other to the extent that it is freed for a being with. The upshot of all this is that while Heidegger continues the theme of freeing a being to be what it is, into the analysis of other Daseins, the circumspection in dealing with the ready-to-hand and freeing it within a totality of references and assignments will have to be different when applied to our dealings with the other. Both will be interpreted in terms of a broader phenomenon of care. objects that are themselves docile will become objects not of circumspection, but of solicitude. When understood as an existentialer, solicitude corresponds to our use of concern. Concern for food and clothing, nursing the sick, and welfare work are grounded in our state of being as being with. The negative and indifferent modes are also so grounded. Being for, against, indifferent to others, passing another by, or not mattering to one another are possible ways of solicitude. The indifferent or deficient modes correspond to our everyday being with one another. Heidegger tells us that these modes of being show again the characteristics of inconspicuousness and obviousness, which belong just as much to the everyday docile with of others within the world as to the readiness to hand of equipment with which one is daily concerned. Even where two dociles do not matter to each other, Heidegger insists that it is a different kind of indifference than that of two present-at-hand things randomly occurring together. In the positive mode, solicitude has two extreme possibilities. It can leap in for the other, taking care away from him, and this allows the other to disburden himself, but at the same time become someone who is dependent or in some sense dominated. By contrast, it is possible to have a kind of solicitude that leaps ahead of the other and gives care authentically back to him. This leaping ahead is one that pertains not to a what for the other, but to his potentiality for being. Heidegger's example of different kinds of solicitude is of people working together. When they are hired to work together for the same affair, such relations often thrive on mistrust. But if the people devote themselves to the same affair in common, their Dasein, each in its own way, is taken hold of as authentically bound together in a way that can free the other in his freedom for himself. According to Heidegger, everyday being with one another maintains itself between the two extremes of positive solicitude, that which leaps in and dominates, and that which leaps forward or forth and liberates. Either way, the worldhood of the world has been interpreted as a referential totality in terms of significance for Dasein's being, as the being for the sake of which Dasein itself is. Likewise, being with belongs to the being of Dasein, even when a particular Dasein does not turn to others and chooses to manage without them. As with the worldhood of the world, being with also has a disclosedness belonging to it, that Heidegger describes on page 123 of the original. Being with is such that the disclosedness of the Dasein with of others belongs to it. This means that because Dasein's being is being with, its understanding of being already implies the understanding of others. This understanding, like any understanding, is not an acquaintance derived from knowledge about them, but a primordially existential kind of being which, more than anything else, makes such knowledge and acquaintance possible. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which understands primordially. This disclosedness to this understanding will be the having of a state of mind. Others are encountered in the environment in a way of concern, such that they are what they do. There is a care as to how we differ from others in decisions made to be with, for, or against others. And so being with one another has a character of distantiality, distance. Due to distantiality, being with one another stands in subjection to others. Its being has been taken away by the others. if only because it cannot be defined except in terms of those others. The others here are not any definite group that we can point to as a they. The who, Heidegger says, is not this one, not that one, not oneself, not some people, not the sum total of them all. The who is neuter das Man. When we are using public transportation or reading newspapers, every other becomes like the next. Being with one another here dissolves one's own Dasein into the kind of being of the others. And it is herein that, according to Heidegger, a tyranny of the they appears. It consists of an inconspicuous dominion, where he says the others, as distinguishable and explicit, vanish more and more. In this inconspicuousness and unascertainability, the real dictatorship of the they is unfolded. We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. The indefinite they, which we all are, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. Yet, at the same time, it does not exactly behave like a tyranny, but can instead be tempting. The they always turns out to be sure of itself, such that there is no need of authentic understanding or the state of mind that goes with it. The supposition of the they that one is leading and sustaining a full and genuine life brings Dasein a tranquility. The problem with the solicitude of the they is that it is the solicitude that leaps in and dominates, rather than the one that leaps forward and liberates. Its essential condition is averageness. It creates a leveling down of the possibilities of being in a publicness, in which all things primordial just get glossed over as well known, and anything mysterious gets passed off as something familiar and accessible to everyone. The they has a process that Heidegger calls idle talk, to create an impression that all is known about or sufficiently understood in the way that things get publicly interpreted. Yet it is unaccountable to any particular Dasein for its judgments and decisions, because it is not a somebody that can argue for itself. Regardless of its inaccessibility and unaccountability in the leveling down of possibilities, it ends up that it was always a they and no one who did it. The they presents every decision and judgment as its own. Heidegger says that the they can, as it were, manage to have them constantly invoking it. Heidegger concludes from this dominion and its unaccountability that the particular Dasein in his everydayness is disburdened of its being inaccommodated. He describes this on at the bottom of page 127 and continuing into 128. Thus the particular Dasein in its everydayness is disburdened by the they. Not only that, by thus disburdening it of its being, the they accommodates Dasein, if Dasein has any tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And because the they constantly accommodates the particular Dasein by disburdening it of its being, the they retains and enhances its stubborn dominion. Everyone is the other and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the question of the who of everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered itself in being among one another. Heidegger, not surprisingly, is interpreting being with as not being something present at hand. It is also not some universal subject that subsumes all under it. It does not function to define and differentiate us under genus and species. Instead, the they becomes itself an existentiale belonging to the constitution of Dasein, which has its own possibilities of sometimes becoming concrete. And it is important that Heidegger has it present as self. He says the self of everyday Dasein is the they self, which we distinguish from the authentic self, that is, from the self which has been taken hold of in its own way. As they self, the particular Dasein has been dispersed into the they and must first find itself. A Dasein discovering and taking hold of itself into authenticity requires a kind of disclosedness that we have already dealt with regarding readiness to hand. Dasein has disclosed to it a totality of involvements and equipment with which the they is familiar. The worldhood of the world then became intelligible in the totality of equipment for the purposes of Dasein, as the being for whom its being is an issue, because the they had already made it intelligible with its interpretation. I have stated earlier that we distinguish ourselves for the most part as what we are also, a auch Dasein. Likewise, I have a self dispersed into the they. Proximally, Dasein is this they, and in this they, I am proximally given to myself as well. Accordingly, we can predict that for Heidegger, authenticity will not constitute an independence from the they self that is in any way complete, as if it were some kind of bad thing that it escapes. In fact, we should expect even that authenticity should require a recognition of our thrownness into the world that has a they into which we can be absorbed as part of our being in the world. Heidegger does not pretend that one can make one's own being in any sense or make radical alterations that deny the they and its social practices that made the world intelligible. He has already indicated that the tyranny to be escaped, or error to be corrected, if that's what it is a limiting or leveling down of the possibilities of being. And thus, authenticity is not to reverse or deny being thrown into the world. The authenticity in transcending the they self is the recognition of possibilities for being that the they levels down. And so Heidegger will regard the authentic self and inauthentic self as modifications of the same Dasein. Likewise, inauthenticity is related to a falling. In this case, it is not to be understood as having fallen into a lower space or status, but into an absorption. It is this falling into the publicness of the they that Heidegger uses to define inauthenticity. But it's not a negative evaluation. And it appears on page 175 at the bottom and beginning of 176. And I will skip part of the paragraph. He says, this term does not express any negative evaluation, but is used to signify that Dasein is proximally and for the most part alongside the world of its concern. This absorption in has mostly the character of being lost in the publicness of the they. Dasein has, in the first instance, fallen away from itself as an authentic potentiality for being itself, and has fallen into the world. Fallenness into the world means an absorption in being with one another. And I'll skip part. Inauthenticity does not mean anything like being no longer in the world, but amounts rather to a quite distinctive kind of being in the world, the kind which is completely fascinated by the world and by the Dasein with of others in the they. Not being itself functions as a positive possibility of that entity, which, in its essential concern, is absorbed in a world. This kind of not being has to be conceived as that kind of being which is closest to Dasein, and in which Dasein maintains itself for the most part. Okay, now I will move on to some parts of Chapter 5 of Being in Time about being in as such, with a discussion about state of mind and angst, or anxiety. The understanding in terms of Dasein's disclosedness will take on a significance that may go beyond a mere awareness of present-at-hand facts, but will not be different from the way Heidegger's predecessors conceive of the understanding. He does not need to argue for a new kind, because awareness of possibilities, of potentiality in addition to actuality, is part of traditional philosophy going back to at least Aristotle's distinction between the two. Dasein is the being that has its possibility to be itself or not be itself in terms of its possibilities. Dasein is delivered over to its possibilities when it is delivered over into itself, and thus Dasein is thrown possibility. Heidegger says that Dasein is this possibility of being free for its current potentiality for being. What Dasein will be capable of will be disclosed to it. It is because the nature of understanding is projection of possibilities. When Dasein is thrown, it is thrown into the kind of being that is projecting. The ready-to-hand is understood in terms of its usability and serviceability. Even in terms of a unity of the present at hand that we call nature, there is the question of it in terms of its possibility. If we want nature to be intelligible to us, one thing to ask is, how is it possible? In terms of Dasein's understanding of Dasein's being, Heidegger says that as projecting, understanding is this kind of being of Dasein, in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. As a result, Dasein will always be essentially more than what it factically is at any given time. The projective character of understanding will be Dasein's sight, that, along with a state of mind, will make a primordial disclosedness of being in the world. In a mood, Dasein will apprehend its possibility. Our moods and our familiarity with everyday matters are to be seen and interpreted as an existentiale. However it may quickly change, Dasein always has some kind of mood. The mood is in terms of a how one is, and will bring being into its there. As noted earlier, Heidegger considered it part of the essential constitution of Dasein to have its there to be. The mood discloses Dasein as that entity to which it has been delivered over to the being which, in existing, it has to be. The fact that Dasein may seek to escape a mood is in fact evidence of it being disclosed as that it is. This is because Dasein, he says, for the most part evades the being that is disclosed in the mood. That being that is disclosed is the one that has its possibilities in a world of the uncertain, rather than the being that is fallen into the they, in which everything is familiar and accessible. The whence and whither are unveiled and disclosed in the thrownness of the being into its there. The thrownness will signify the facticity of its being delivered over. The that it is that is disclosed in Dasein's state of mind is an existential attribute of an entity that has being in the world, a characteristic existentiale of Dasein rather than a present-at-hand fact about it. In terms of its disclosedness, Dasein in its state of mind is brought before itself in terms of finding itself in a mood. If it is a bad mood, such as fear, it may seek to evade it by mastering its mood if it cannot evade the thing being feared. Either way, in a state of mind that involves a turning away, one is disclosed in one's thrownness. One may choose to try to master a negative mood and try to turn it into its opposite by convincing oneself of something rational. Nevertheless, Heidegger argues that this particular disclosure is not a matter of cognition or volition originally, and therefore, even in some kind of irrationalism, the disclosure is no less valid. We have seen earlier that the ready-to-hand became truly unveiled to us in the failure mode. Here we see Heidegger appealing to the negative mode again when he argues the evasive turning away of negative moods. This forms the first of three characteristics he will ascribe to states of mind, namely here that they disclose Dasein in its thrownness, and, proximally for the most part, in the manner of an evasive turning away. They disclose Dasein in its thrownness in the matter of an evasive turning away. For Heidegger, a bad mood is not anything like apprehending a bad physical condition. Not only is it not cognitive, but it is also beyond it in the range of what these mental acts can disclose. The bad mood discloses the there more primordially. States of mind may fail to get reflected upon, but there is nevertheless something positive here. The mood has disclosed, in every case, being in the world as a whole, and makes possible, first of all, to direct oneself toward something. It is here that we find in the second characteristic of states of mind that the world, being in, and being in the world are disclosed equiprimordially. A third characteristic of states of mind is that they give us a deeper understanding of the worldhood of the world. This has to do with circumspection again, and as a necessary condition for the ready-to-hand to be encountered as authentically ready-to-hand. In circumspective concern exists a state of mind that can encounter a world in which the ready-to-hand and its toward which can matter to it, especially when frustrated by failures of unreadiness to hand. So Heidegger states that to be affected by the unserviceable, resistant, or threatening character of that which is ready to hand becomes ontologically possible only insofar as being in, as such, has been determined existentially beforehand in such a manner that what it encounters within the world can matter to it. The totality of the worldhood of the world pointed to Dasein's purposes, as the being that takes a stance on its being. This is also why we might not only perceive things, but also be touched by them or affected, especially when encountering resistance. Heidegger draws from this a conclusion that a state of mind existentially must disclose a submission to the world, within which something can matter to us, in order for us to be affected. In the phenomenon of falling, we have Dasein fleeing from itself in the sense of its own possibilities, because the everydayness of the they-self limits possibilities. In this way it is inauthentic, such that being oneself is closed off in the falling. In falling, one is afraid or anxious about something. Phenomenally, the full disclosedness that Dasein is fleeing from itself is disguised. That is to say, we do not yet have a disclosure that Dasein is fleeing from Dasein itself as Dasein, rather than maybe a ready-to-hand object that it is fleeing. One can blame the fear or anxiety about a thing or condition for the falling back into the tranquility of the they that limits possibilities. Of course, it was Dasein itself that was that in the face of which Dasein was fleeing. It was a flight from itself because it fled from its own most possibilities of being. But what if it was an anxiety that is located nowhere and not explainable as an anxiety about anything? Would that then phenomenally give us Dasein's disclosedness, not only that it is fleeing itself, but also that it itself is that in the face of which it flees? Heidegger believes a general idea of anxiety can serve the function, allowing for an ontologically essential account of the full disclosedness of Dasein fleeing itself directly. To bring itself face to face with itself is what Dasein does not do when it flees. This turning away discloses it's there. Anxiety is kindred with fear, although fear produces a shrinking back from a fearsome entity within the world. But the fear involved in the turning away from itself in falling is not founded on fear of entities in the world. The turning away from falling is to turn thither toward entities in the world as Dasein flees into the world of concern. Because being in the world is a basic state of Dasein, Heidegger tells us that in the face of which one has anxiety is being in the world as such. The difference is that what makes Dasein anxious is not an entity within the world. It thus has no involvement that can be threatening. In anxiety, the world of involvements collapses into something that has no significance. That in the face of which one has anxiety is nowhere, while at the same time being so close that it is oppressive. So once again we have a full Heideggerian disclosedness in the negative mode. As a phenomenon, Heidegger tells us this means that the world as such is that in the face of which one has anxiety. When the world of significance temporarily ceases to be important, on the basis of the insignificance of what is in the worldhood and the world are obtrusive. According to Heidegger, what oppresses us is not a thing, but a possibility of the ready-to-hand in general. We commonly write off anxiety as having been about nothing because it was not about a fear of a particular entity. That in the face of which anxiety is anxious is nothing ready to hand, but not really nothing. The world belongs to Dasein's being as being in the world. Therefore, the world as such is the nothing exhibiting itself as that in the face of which one has anxiety, indicating that being in the world itself is that in the face of which anxiety is anxious. It is the world as world that anxiety discloses to us, when anxiety is a state of mind, when it is anxiety not in the face of something, but rather anxiety about something. The threat becomes indefinite. The world, in single quotes, the totality of entities, and the Dasein width of others can offer nothing. The world of the they-self and the way things have been interpreted temporarily ceases to be something that Dasein can use to understand itself in its terms. With the breaking away of the they-self and its world, anxiety individualizes Dasein for its own most possibilities and its own most being in the world. It will be both because being in the world projects itself onto possibilities. An example I might give to this is having to make a presentation at school or at work and being anxious about it. The threat, if you want to call it that, is not a definite entity. It is rather possibilities of screwing up, looking nervous, maybe a wardrobe malfunction. And these form part of the list of your own most thrown possibilities that your understanding is projecting. The list could also include refusing to do it or taking up the challenge anyway. In individualizing Dasein, anxiety brings Dasein face to face with its being free for authenticity of its being. This possibility is something that Dasein always is. It is also the being to which Dasein has been delivered over in its being in the world. Thus, Heidegger will tell us that about which anxiety is anxious reveals itself as that in the face of which it is anxious, namely being in the world. This self-sameness between what anxiety is about and what it is in the face of will also apply to anxiousness itself. This self-sameness allows what was seen to be required earlier, namely that we now have a disclosedness to Dasein, not only that it is fleeing itself, but also that it itself is that in the face of which it flees. Also, in comparison to falling, where we have the flight into the they-self in the world of entities, we now have shifted to the breakdown of the significance of the world of entities and of the interpretations of the they. In everyday discourse and interpretation, this anxiety is characterized as a kind of uncanniness or not feeling at home. The publicness of the they has a tranquilizing self-assurance of being at home. When being in enters the existential mode of not at home, this is what Heidegger calls uncanniness. When Dasein flees in the face of the not at home, it flees toward the publicness of the they. Uncanniness is what threatens lostness in the they, and thus its tranquility. But the everydayness of fleeing shows phenomenally that anxiety belongs to being in the world. The tranquilized and familiar being in the world is a mode of Dasein's uncanniness, not the reverse. Therefore, the not at home is the more primordial phenomenon. Ultimately, it is because anxiety is always latent in being in the world that concernful being alongside can ever be afraid. Okay, now to sum it up into a nice little package with some final comments. In summary, being in the world is a unified phenomenon that is Dasein's being to be. Anxiety not directed at a particular object, but rather at a feeling of uncanniness, will disclose to Dasein its being in the world, which also is its own most possibilities as the being for which its being is an issue. The nature of the understanding of Dasein is to project into possibilities. In confronting possibilities, Dasein effectively confronts its existence and takes a stand on its being in what it chooses, gets caught up in, or gets born into. In doing so, a possibility that opens up is that of something mattering to Dasein. This allows for the worldhood of the world of circumspection and the ready-to-hand. Its totality of references and assignments are what matter to Dasein in circumspection. This is why Heidegger stated earlier of being in the world that it amounts to a non-thematic circumspective absorption in references or assignments, constitutive for the readiness to hand of a totality of equipment. This totality and its purpose also point to other beings with the character of Dasein, who are also being in the world. This being in is a being alongsidedness with objects and others of the character of Dasein. With others, Dasein has together what one does, or a Das Man, that is its they self, that it will be most of the time. The Das Man includes the world of circumspection that exists in a world of commonly shared practices. This ultimately adds up to a unity of worldhood, the being that is a who within it, and being in as such. States of mind in general will result in disclosure of being with and being in the world equipped primordially. They will also give deeper meaning to the worldhood of the world that is part of the totality. Full and clear disclosedness will be in the negative mode. The unreadiness to hand of a ready-to-hand object that is broken or missing discloses the totality of references and assignments that include the purpose that is being temporarily frustrated and which otherwise would serve Dasein as it takes a stand on its being. When fear or another negative emotion, such as frustration, is directed in particular to something, Dasein has disclosed to it the thrownness of its being delivered into its there, that is also its there to be. This can also be related to a ready-to-hand object. In response to this, in a negative emotion or anxiety about a particular, Dasein may withdraw into its fallenness, into the tranquilizing effect of the they and its interpretations. When this fleeing occurs, it is disguised that Dasein is fleeing from itself, and that it is itself that in the face of which it flees. One can always blame this on an object or even another Dasein, but a general anxiety that is said to be about nothing brings Dasein face to face with itself as being in the world. In fleeing, it is both fleeing from itself and that in the face of which it flees. What it discloses for one to flee is one's ownmost possibilities as individualized in its being that is in each case mine. In terms of the disclosedness, and my thesis of a new and different kind of knowledge, Heidegger has it occur in the same understanding that involves a type of cognitive recognition. He does describe parts of it as not cognitive or volitional in its origin, but it is still an awareness of facts. Perhaps he wanted to avoid a statement that sometimes an emotion may be cognitive, but at some point it clearly becomes such in some sense. And I believe I have the text to justify a cognitive awareness that, rather than just a knowing how. Heidegger still wants to regard it as primordial, as being necessary for having ontical knowledge in the sciences. This seems difficult to argue against because pursuing such curiosity about the world of nature is one of Dasein's possibilities. At several points, Heidegger describes it as a non-thematic knowledge. If I need to go out on a limb, I will call it a hybrid between acquaintance and knowledge of facts, due to its origins sometimes having emotional elements. Now, there exists an objection from persons who are fascinated with ontical sciences, especially physics, and I think it's more insignificant than instructive. This science seems to at times baffle and amaze us with counterintuitive findings. We have light not only traveling, but also being subject to gravity. There is also a humorous retelling of how the space between atoms is greater than the volume of the atoms themselves, and people point to a chair that you sit on as being made of a mostly empty space and a possibility that you may fall through. These theories, however, of astronomy refer to the very large and far away, while those of quantum physics refer to the very small. An argument is still made about the inconsistency of the everyday world of the Lebenswelt, or world of everyday life, or what others might call common sense. In the version of Bertrand Russell, this argument states it to be part of the Lebenswelt, to declare that the world is what the physicist tells us it is, while we are told what seems insane to us. Therefore, if the Lebenswelt is true, it is false, and therefore it is false. I will counter-argue that in the world of everydayness, or even in an anxious state, Dasein may wear spectacles, but neither microscopes nor telescopes. Even the slowing of time, or the gain of mass at velocities close to the speed of light, will still, at speeds possible while remaining on the planet, be more than comfortably below any threshold of recognition and ordinary measurement with non-atomic clocks and scales. Therefore, these matters are not in coexistence with an existentiale in any sense greater than being something that the they-self and its circumspection absorbs ontically. Still, that being said, this non-thematic understanding exists alongside rational thought and can at times be unified with it sometimes, with the rational thought taking a priority. As an example, I will point to the revolution of Copernicus. We all come to know that the Earth orbits the Sun, but nothing Copernicus or Heidegger can ever say would change the fact that the Sun appears to orbit the Earth and continues to do so. This is something we understand in our everydayness, as Heidegger uses the term, at least as long as the they continues to teach it to each new generation that would otherwise believe what will always be empirically implied, that the Sun orbits the Earth. Although we can argue about just how significant this is, it constitutes another question left dangling, not dealt with, of how the rational world of objective measurements and the world as an existentiale coexist, and can do so in such a manner that the rational one will sometimes take priority, notwithstanding Heidegger's contention of it not being primordial. We also understand in our everydayness that in our use of a totality of equipment we are standing on the shoulders of the thinking of Daseins that preceded us. None of this is disputed by Heidegger. He just leaves it for the ontological sciences. But I think there are ontological considerations in this coexistence of worlds that are consistent with his method of inquiry. And if I'm right, it further leaves this inquiry at least incomplete. And that's all for now. If you like my video, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Check out my other videos on my channel. Thanks for watching.